friends, welcome back to my channel. If you've not been here before, this is Cruel Intentions, a true crime channel. I am Holly, and every week I take you on a journey throughout Australian true crime history. Thank you so much for joining me for part 1 of episode 5, and for joining me on Shark Week. If you are interested in Australian true crime and you love a twangy accent, then consider hitting the subscribe button. Or don't, I'm not here to tell you what to do, I'm not your real mum, and I never will be. Today I'm going to be sharing with you the officially unsolved case of the shark arm murder that occurred in Sydney. Now there are a lot of players in this case, so it's important that you get an understanding of who they all are, so you'll be getting some in-depth information on a few different people. Now, while there have been a couple of prime suspects, the case has never officially been solved, which means we also get to discuss theories as well, which is why you'll need to know who all of the people are, or were. So we're going back to the 1920s and 30s. It was the time of razor gangs and the Great Depression, and Sydney was then home to over 1.2 million residents, made up mostly of immigrants from England, Ireland and Scotland and their families. The sun, surf and sport attracted many people to the beautiful Sydney Harbour and to the suburbs along the coast like Manly, Bondi and Coogee. At the northern end of Coogee Beach, brothers Charlie and Bert Hobson were the owners of the Coogee Aquarium baths. It was a public swimming spot for bathers during the summer, and in the winter and autumn months it became an exhibit for the sea creatures that the brothers would catch off of the coast. Now, they had been perfecting the art of catching and displaying sharks for years. Shivers of sharks, which is the collective noun for sharks, which is awesome, shivers of sharks were often seen off the coast of Sydney, attracted no doubt by the waste that was dumped into the waterways by local abattoirs and markets. They displayed their first tiger shark Gertie in April 1930 and went on to display over 20 more, and they had gained a reputation in Sydney for being a must-see attraction. Now, the research and knowledge that we have now makes it much easier to care for these animals in proper aquariums, but as much as they tried back then, unfortunately a lot of the sharks died in captivity, as did many of the other animals that had been caught for the exhibit. So they continued to fish for these animals to keep a steady flow of income coming into the aquarium. In 1934, Sydney beaches had 8 separate shark attacks, resulting in 6 deaths, and the public interest in sharks was growing at an enormous rate. The residents, having read all of the gory details in the local paper, were curious to see the animals up close, and the Hobson brothers knew that they were in a perfect position to take advantage of this growing curiosity. They knew that there would be some very good money to be made off of the fascination with these animals. On the 17th of April 1935, Bert and his brother's son Ron went out fishing in hopes of catching another shark to put on display. Their fishing expedition that day was not successful and they came back empty-handed, but they had left several baited lines out off of Coogee Beach overnight. Now, when they returned the next morning, they were pleased to see that they had caught a small shark, but they were even more delighted to see that a much larger tiger shark had attacked the smaller one and in the process had become caught in the lines that they had left out. It was exhausted from its efforts to untangle itself, but all the better for Hobson and his nephew, as it was able to be easily towed back to shore, dragged up the beach and lifted into the aquarium. The shark had already been weak from fighting the fishing lines, but now it had been out of the water for more than 45 minutes. It lay at the bottom of the tank, barely moving and appearing almost dead from the ordeal. When the Hobson brothers pumped more oxygen into the pool, the shark seemed to revive and ate small amounts of food, and the brothers went ahead and advertised their latest catch in the local paper for people to come and see the largest tiger shark ever in captivity. Now, I don't know if that claim is actually true, it's just what they'd put in the paper. A week later, on Thursday the 25th of April 1935, every hotel room in Sydney City was completely booked out. It was Anzac Day and it was the 20th anniversary of the Gallipoli landing. family and friends of ex-servicemen arrived in the thousands, and the Anzac Day Parade celebrated over 60,000 veterans and had over 300,000 spectators. The aquarium had opened early to take advantage of the large influx of visitors, and many people had gone to see the newly acquired tiger shark. The attendees had petered out through the afternoon, and by 4:15 there was only a handful of people at the aquarium. One of these people was Narcisse Leo Young. He worked for the local paper, the Sydney Morning Herald, and he'd been watching the shark for about 15 minutes. At around 4:30 p.m. that afternoon, he noticed the shark become very active. It had previously been quite docile, not eating very much or very often, and swimming slowly from one side of the tank to the other, looking pretty off colour. So Young took notice when the shark started to thresh in the water. He said that the shark flayed the water with its tail, beating the water to foam. It started swimming rapidly around the enclosure, bumping into the sides and sending water spilling from over the sides of the pool. The shark stopped suddenly and began sinking to the bottom of the pool, but on the way down it had vomited, and when Young took a closer look, he saw a large amount of scum floating on the water, some pieces of undigested food, and a human arm. The shark then started swimming normally again, but looked pretty off colour and pretty unwell, and unfortunately the shark actually died a few days later. Bert Hobson, who was supervising the aquarium on that afternoon, said that he too saw the shark threshing about its enclosure, and when he went to inspect what the shark had regurgitated, he noticed shark fins and parts of the smaller shark that this one had eaten, a rat, a bird, and a man's left arm, with a length of rope tied around the wrist. Hobson called the local Randwick police station right away and reported the arm being disgorged by the shark. Detective Constable Frank Head and Constable John Mannion arrived at the aquarium and found the Hobson brothers clearing the other debris from the pool. The officers pulled the dismembered arm from the water, and the first thing that they noticed was a tattoo on the inner forearm of two boxes facing each other. The outline of the tattoo was blue and they had red boxing shorts. This might be the key to identifying the body that this arm had been removed from. Bert Hobson told detectives that he'd been monitoring the pool since they'd put the shark on display, and it was impossible to enter the aquarium after hours, so the arm was definitely not placed in there by any other means. Detective Constable Head was shown the mesh around the intake pump that pumped fresh seawater into the tank, and confirmed that it could not have been sucked in from the ocean. The Hobson brothers also confirmed that they'd actually cleaned the bottom of the enclosure earlier that morning, and the arm had definitely not been there. And all of the witnesses to the event, including Young, confirmed that the arm was definitely vomited up by the shark and had not been in the water beforehand. Constable John Lindsay from the fingerprint branch of the police arrived soon after, and some degloving had happened around the skin of the hand, so he was able to carefully cut the skin from the fingertips to try and get fingerprints from the mysterious tattooed arm. Head filed his report stating that the arm had been removed from the body at the shoulder joint and had 2 incised wounds on the upper and lower parts of the limb. He noted the rope tied around the wrist and remarked that the arm was in a fair state of preservation except for the detachment of some of the skin around the heel and palm of the hand. The arm was then sent to the city morgue where Dr. Palmer and Dr. Coppelson examined the limb. Dr. Palmer was a veteran medical examiner, having spent 26 years working for the government, and Dr. Coppelson was a renowned surgeon and was somewhat of an expert in shark attack wounds. They found that the arm had particular scratch marks around the cartilage covering the arm bone, and the arm at the point of removal did not seem to have any ragged tears or bite marks. So both men agreed that this arm had not been bitten off by the shark. This arm had been cut off the person who owned it before having been swallowed by the tiger shark. Due to the carelessness of the incision marks around the wound and a few other cut marks that they observed, they both also agreed that this had not been a surgical procedure. So the arm had not been removed for any medical reason by a doctor, nor had it been bitten off by the shark. They were unable to agree, however, on whether the person the arm came from was dead or alive when the arm was removed. The newspapers in Sydney were having a field day with the discovery of the arm being vomited up by the shark in the Coogee Aquarium baths. There was speculation among reporters that perhaps this had been a suicide, that the man had drowned himself off of the coast and had been eaten by the shark. The Sydney Morning Herald even contacted David Stead, a shark expert and naturalist, who gave one explanation as to why the flesh had not been digested in the time it had been in the shark. He said that usually the strong gastric acid of a shark would digest a human arm within about 36 hours, but it was possible for normal digestion of that animal to have been halted by a drastic change in its environment, like being pulled from the ocean and transferred to a small aquarium. Now, tiger sharks are known to hunt in the deep sea and rarely spend a lot of time in shallow water, so therefore are far more sensitive to light, which is why you'll actually find almost no tiger sharks in modern aquariums. You will find sand tiger sharks, which are a completely different species, but this is probably the reason that the shark didn't survive too long after the incident. Stead reported that being transferred to the pool may have upset the shark's system and may have disrupted the normal digestion of the animal. Another accepted theory is that the arm had actually been swallowed by the smaller shark, which was a different species and didn't have the same digestion. And when the tiger shark ate the smaller one, it would have needed to digest the smaller shark first, leaving the arm almost untouched. Sydney's gossip newspaper, called Truth, was a popular subscription in the 1930s, with a readership of over 210,000 and was released each Sunday. On Sunday the 28th of April, they reported on the bizarre shark arm case. They had sent journalists to the Coogee pools, where the Hobsons were more than happy for the attention and were eager to give their take on what had happened. The newspaper reported that the detectives were certain that they were going to be able to get fingerprints from the arm, but that they would love to speak with anyone who might recognize the tattoo that was found on the forearm. Half an hour away from Coogee in Gladesville, in a small cottage, Mrs. Malloy was reading this article when she called to her daughter Gladys, saying that the tattoo in the article looked remarkably like that of Gladys's husband, James "Jim" Smith. Jim had left a few weeks before on a fishing trip and hadn't yet come home, but Gladys was in denial that it could be him, and besides, Jim had left for weeks at a time before. Later that day, though, Jim's brother Edward Smith came to the cottage that Gladys and Jim shared with Gladys's mother and shared his concerns that the arm might belong to his brother. Edward rang the Randwick Police Department and an officer was dispatched to his home in Newtown. Edward told the detectives that his brother had this same tattoo that he'd seen in the paper, and the next day they accompanied Edward and Gladys back to the station and showed them an enlarged photo of the arm. They both confirmed with certainty that this arm belonged to Edward's brother and Gladys's husband, Jim Smith. The superintendent of the Criminal Investigation Bureau, or CIB, was William Silent Bill Pryor, and most people in this case are going to have some kind of nickname. Sometimes they have nothing to do with their actual names, but we'll get to that. Now, Pryor was well known throughout Sydney's underworld. He was said to be very, very fair, even when interrogating the worst criminals. And he had an uncanny ability to get people to trust him, so much so that he'd built up a sizable network of fizgigs, which is what they called police informants, who supplied him with regular information about criminal activity. Now, when the shark arm case happened, he was already under the weight of 3 other unsolved murders, and detectives were under intense media scrutiny for not having any ideas as to how these murders had come about. One in particular was the Pajama Girl murder, which is a case I'm actually going to cover next month. But a young woman's body had been found wearing yellow silk pajamas. She had been shot, beaten, drenched in kerosene, and badly burnt. Detectives had followed up leads on over 500 missing girls, but had so far come up empty-handed, and this left media and newspapers wondering if perhaps criminals were getting better, or if the police were getting worse at their jobs. Pryor and his detectives knew that they needed to solve the shark arm case and solve it quickly. It was a sensational case, and the press and public would have a hawk eye on them. They were already dealing with the bad press of other unsolved murders, and they did not need another one on the list. The day that Gladys and Edward had identified the arm, Pryor's hand-picked team had been there. They were his most experienced detectives. Detective Sergeant Frank Matthews and Leonard Almond, and Detectives Devereaux McDermott, Reuben Baker, and Milton Kalman. Frank Matthews was the lead investigator for the case, and although he was very good at his job, he was not well liked by other officers, who complained that he was a loner and he preferred to work by himself. He made decisions without informing or discussing it with other officers and was not a very good team player. Gladys told the officers that her husband had gone down to Cronulla, where he'd been hired to take a wealthy man from another state out on a fishing trip and was to be paid £5 for the work. Gladys told them that he was supposed to be contacted at the Hotel Cecil in Cronulla. He had left the cottage wearing a blue shirt, a grey suit, tan shoes, and was carrying a small brown leather bag that belonged to Jim and Gladys's 17-year-old son, Raymond. She also told them that 5 days after he'd left, her neighbour, who frequently took messages for the Smiths, told her that she'd received a call from a man in a gruff voice that she didn't know, saying that Jim would not be returning home until the following Monday. But that day came and went, and Jim still had not returned. The same morning that Gladys was sharing this with police officers, John Lindsay, the fingerprinter, had been able to produce clear images of the thumb and ring fingerprint from the dismembered arm. The department had received the information that the family members had identified the picture of the arm as belonging to Jim Smith, and luckily, Jim had actually been fingerprinted 3 years before in 1932 when he was taken in for operating a premises where illegal betting had been occurring. The head of the fingerprinting branch had compared the prints of Jim Smith and the prints that were recovered from the arm, and he confirmed that they were a match. The file that contained Jim Smith's fingerprints also contained a detailed description of the boxer tattoo. The identity was confirmed, and the arm that had been in the shark just yesterday was now known to be the arm of Jim Smith. James Jim Smith was born in Camberwell, South London on the 30th of April 1891 to John and Nora Smith. John was a builder's labourer and Nora was a homemaker, raising her 4 children. Jim had 2 younger brothers and a younger sister. But the family were really poor and Nora struggled to provide for the children, so Jim took up work in his teens as a coal miner. And eventually he saved enough money to board a local steamship, the Orsova, and make his way to Australia in search of a better life for himself and his family. He arrived in Australia on Saturday the 27th of November 1909 and settled in Sydney. He was a well-liked member of the community, and people described him as tall and well-built, good with his fists, and happy-go-lucky. He'd taken up amateur boxing, and though he had a lot of enthusiasm, he didn't actually have the talent needed to make it big in the sport, but he was content enough to stay in the amateur game. Now, a year after he arrived in Australia, his brother Edward joined him, travelling in another steamship. The brothers were close, and they'd prearranged that Edward would join Jim once Edward had saved enough money for the trip and Jim had established a home and some money in Sydney. His boxing trainer, Jack Burke, years later, when he saw the article about the shark arm and the following confirmation of Jim's identity, said that he was one of the finest chaps in the world. He had a buoyant temperament, was free and open-minded about everything, and he was a thoroughly good sport. Jim had met Gladys Malloy in Sydney. She worked as a milliner or hat maker, and in 1916 he had married her, with his brother by his side as his best man. He'd been working previously as a barman and billiard room attendant, but after he and Gladys got married, he started running his own billiard room in Rozelle. In 1917, Jim and Gladys had their only child, a son named Raymond. In 1920, Jim became the proprietor of the Rozelle Sports Club, a billiard parlour. Now, gambling in Sydney during that time was massive, particularly horse and greyhound racing, and racing clubs like Tattersalls were making a killing from bookmaking. Now, although off-course betting was officially illegal, Jim Smith had started an SP betting business on the side of his billiard room. SP betting is starting price betting, which basically means that the odds are fixed and don't fluctuate. Because of the government's lax enforcement of the illegal betting trade, Jim was able to get away with this side business for many years, and by 1925 he'd saved enough money to bring his mother and other 2 siblings to Australia from England. His father had unfortunately passed away in that time, but he now had the rest of his loving and supportive family by his side again. Now, he decided at this time to go in a new and very strange business direction. He sold his stake in the sports club and went into partnership with a man named William Young, an architect who had friends in high places in the wealthy North Shore elite. Young was to finance and plan for the construction of blocks of flats, and Jim would oversee the construction. Now, apart from his father being a builder's labourer, Jim Smith had no experience or knowledge of the building or construction industry, so it seemed like a pretty weird business decision to make. He had previously partook in some illegal activity, but he was now about to head down the path of corruption. By 1929, Young and Smith had built 2 blocks of flats around the Sydney harbour side. All of the contracts had been taken out in Jim Smith's name, and he would end up taking the fall for the scam that was operating behind the scenes. It's unknown if Jim knew about the scam, but it sort of went like this. A group of wealthy businessmen, including Young, would use Jim Smith as a dummy contractor. They'd raise just enough capital to build the blocks of flats, but not pay any of the suppliers or workers who built them. They would sell the blocks of flats before completion, and the businessmen would take the profit. On completion of the flats, and after the businessmen had split all of the gains, Jim Smith was left with nothing, and he ended up filing for bankruptcy, which kind of tells me he maybe wasn't in on it. Now, the 2 businessmen that were behind the shady deal were Reginald "Reg" Holmes and Albert "Albie" Stannard. Reg and Albie had grown up knowing nothing but wealth and prosperity. Reg's father was a builder of luxury yachts, launches and speedboats, and was considered to be the best in Sydney, while Albie's father and uncles supplied the smaller tugboats and lighters to service the ships coming into Sydney Harbour, and they also ran a lighterage service. Now, if you don't know much about boats, and I certainly didn't, so thanks Google, a lighter was basically a vessel that was used to carry ships' cargo if they needed to release some weight to meet the standards for docking in the harbour. So Albie Stannard's family would go out on a lighter and provide that service for the many, many ships that wanted to come into Sydney. And a launch was a smaller motorised boat that's kept on larger ships and yachts to get in and out of the harbour if they're not docked there. Reg Holmes and Albie Stannard both took over their respective fathers' businesses in the early 1920s and became prosperous businessmen, owing to the amount of sea travel that was happening at that time. Now, Stannard was described as generous and popular, quick to lend money for men in need, and he was well liked. But he was also ruthless when it came to his business. He had power and he had money, and this was at a time when men were desperate for work. So his men, the men that worked for and with him, protected his interests with gusto. If you were on the outs with Stannard, you were pretty much cut off from working anywhere on the wharves. He was a man about town and no one was going to cross him. Holmes, however, was a private and often secluded man, and because of the different businesses they ran, Holmes was much harder hit by the Depression. I mean, no one was really buying luxury yachts and speedboats at a time where men were desperate for work and people were struggling to get by. So Holmes was pretty desperate by that point to maintain his lavish lifestyle, hence the building scam. And Holmes and Stannard also realised they could make extra money in the smuggling trade. By the early 1930s, almost everything coming from overseas, including people, was coming by sea. Passengers and cargo mostly needed to come to shore by way of lighters or launches, and Stannard and Holmes were in a perfect position to be the first in line to provide the service. They were overwhelmed with unemployed men looking for a few bucks, so these men were hired as skippers of the smaller vessels. The skippers would pick up illegal drugs or other contraband from the larger ships, and in return would give a percentage of what they made to Holmes and Stannard. If the items they were hired to smuggle were too big or in too large a quantity, they would actually be thrown overboard at a prearranged spot to be picked up by one of Holmes's speedboats or one of Stannard's launches and would be transported into the city. Holmes and Stannard were living large with their new source of income, and it wasn't long before Jim Smith, who had been duped by them in the flat building scheme, came along asking for a handout. Jim went to Reg Holmes in July of 1931 and told him that he wanted £300 to open a new sports club. Holmes knew that Jim could ruin him with his knowledge of the building scam and so lent him the money. Jim opened the Roselle Athletic Club and went back to his roots of billiards and illegal betting. But in 1932 the government changed, and under this new conservative regime the police were ordered to find and shut down illegal SP betting. On Monday, September 12, 1932, police raided the Roselle Athletic Club and arrested Jim Smith for illegal betting. He was taken to the station, given a hefty fine, and fingerprinted, and these would be the prints that were later matched to the arm that came from the shark. By 1933, Jim Smith had no money left, so he went back to see his old friend Reg Holmes, and a couple of months later he was employed as a skipper on Reg Holmes's launches. In August of 1933, Smith was suspected of stealing billiard balls from the Roselle Athletics Club, now under new ownership. The detectives were pretty sure it was Jim, so he was taken to the station for questioning, and Jim asked that if the balls were returned, would the matter just go away? The detectives said they couldn't make any promises, but Smith then said he could also put them onto one of the biggest smuggling cases in Sydney if given the chance. He said that he was presently driving launches for an old friend, and it would astound detectives to know how much smuggling was actually going on. Jim rang the detectives a couple of days later and told them where they could find the billiard balls, and he also arranged for a secret meeting in Balmain where he picked up Detective Arantz in a launch. Jim explained to the detective that the launch they were on was the one used for the big smuggling jobs, and that he had also overheard a plan that his associates had to go and get a boat builder from Neutral Bay the following Saturday night, a man named Halfensell, and kidnap him. His associates said that Halfensell had been doing them a lot of harm in the smuggling trade, and Smith thought they planned to murder this man. He asked the detectives to be in another boat and follow them as he was very worried. The detective told Smith to call when they had completed the arrangements and when he had more details, and the detective would fix it up. Smith never did call the detective, and Arantz assumed that it was a hoax. He did believe that smuggling was happening, and he did also find the man that Smith had spoken of, but he was actually named Lars Halverson. Detective Arantz, thinking that this was some sort of ploy, never reported this incident until Jim Smith's arm was identified 2 years later. And when he did end up telling the other detectives about this incident, it confirmed for them that, number one, his associates were capable of arranging murder, and number two, Jim Smith was willing to give police information to save him from other charges, that he was willing to become an informant, or fizzgig. And in the Australian criminal underworld, there was no bigger motive for murder than being a police informant. By late 1933, Albie Stannard and Reg Holmes were making a fine living off lighterage and launches, as well as smuggling, but they had other business ideas, mainly insurance fraud. They had figured out a way to run a marine insurance scam without ever being connected to the vessel or the insurance claim, and they were keen to get their plan in motion. They already had in their possession the boat they had planned to shipwreck, and they had arranged this purchase back in early 1933 when E.W. Williams travelled with his family to Sydney on their luxury cruiser, the Pathfinder. A week after they had landed, Holmes approached Williams and asked if he would be prepared to sell the boat. After some tense negotiations, the agreed purchase price was £3,350. Holmes acted as the agent for the wealthy buyer Albert Thompson and forwarded Williams a bank cheque made out for the agreed price. Albert Thompson was actually one of Albie Stannard's golfing buddies who had agreed to act as the buyer for a cut of £500. An insurance policy was taken out on the boat in Thompson's name for £3,500. A month later, Holmes approached a friend and real estate agent, Greg Vaughan, and discussed the scam with him. Vaughan quickly agreed to act as another dummy owner and bought the boat. Vaughan contacted and invited a marine surveyor, Captain Innes, aboard the boat, with Holmes coming along acting as boat builder and expert. Holmes remarked that the vessel was of the highest quality, and if he were to build a boat of this kind, he would not be able to do it for less than £10,600. Innes was being given this figure by a man with an excellent reputation, by a master boat builder, and with this assurance, he signed the valuation. Vaughan took the signed certificate to the insurers the following day, and the boat was insured for the sum of £8,500. In just 2 months, the boat had increased in value by over £5,000, which today is about $500,000. The boat since then had been moored in Lavender Bay and was being looked after by Sid Murray. In August, at the same time that Jim Smith was telling detectives about the smuggling in the harbour, Holmes told Murray to scuttle or shipwreck the vessel. Murray refused and immediately quit his job as caretaker of the vessel. Stannard actually went to Murray's home a few nights later and urged him to return, but again Murray refused. Stannard told Murray that Holmes was waiting in the car just up the road and they should at least go and talk to him and discuss the situation. But Murray again refused, fearing that an attempt that night would be made on his life. His home was in a remote area, it was dark, and he knew all about the scam, but didn't want to take part. Stannard and Holmes now needed to find someone else to take part in the fraud to replace Murray, and Jim Smith was their obvious choice. They decided to test out Smith's sea legs before they gave him the all-important task of scuttling the Pathfinder. In October of that year, they asked him to sail and deliver a 9-metre or 30-foot launch called the Schnapper to Jervis Bay, a 160-kilometre or 100-mile journey. He completed this task without a hitch, which was incredible considering he really had no sailing experience over any sort of long distance. He delivered the boat and returned to Sydney. Holmes and Stannard had actually been testing a smaller insurance scam with the Schnapper. They had convinced another man, Edward Grant, who worked in a shoe store that Stannard owned a part of, to act as the owner, and then had him rent the boat to the man that Jim Smith had delivered it to, on the condition that this man, W.L. Clark, insured the boat for the sum of £450, which he did. Once the rental period was up, 2 employees of Stannard took back possession of the boat and set fire to it. One of the men was severely burnt in the face, and once they arrived back in Sydney, Grant and that employee went into the insurance offices, and upon hearing the story and seeing the burns, the full insured sum was paid to Grant, who withdrew the cash and handed it straight to Holmes. Their plan had worked perfectly, and between them, Holmes and Stannard walked away with about £250 after expenses, which today would be about $24,000. They needed to wait some time before trying this scheme again, as they were smart businessmen. So in January of 1934, they sailed the Pathfinder from Lavender Bay to Broken Bay on the north coast, about an hour and a half away, and spent the next few months taking advantage of the beautiful summer weather. In March of 1934, Jim Smith was having a drink in the local hotel when he met up with an old friend of his that he'd met through the illegal gambling trade, a man by the name of Patrick "Paddy" Brady. Smith went on to tell Paddy all about his adventures aboard the Pathfinder and asked Paddy if he'd like to join him on the yacht he was looking after. The offer was irresistible to Paddy, who had never been aboard a luxury yacht before. Smith was also open with him about the other activities that he and his associates had been up to, and Paddy was very interested in all of it: the smuggling, the money, but most of all, the blackmail. After all, if he knew their secrets, he could swindle more out of Holmes and Stannard, just like Smith had done when he got the money for the athletics club. Now, Paddy Brady was not some wide-eyed innocent party. He had been making his living out of forgery and had spent many stretches in different prisons over the years. Born in Sydney on the 18th of October 1893 to Peter and Catherine Brady, Paddy had committed his first illegal offence at the age of 11. He had broken into a home in December of 1904 and had stolen watches, jewellery and other possessions worth about £120, which today would have been $11,000. His fingerprints were found on the window, and even though he swore black and blue that he hadn't done it, he was sentenced to 5 years in reform school. Towards the end of his sentence, he escaped, and he spent the next few years drifting around the country doing odd farming jobs and mostly keeping out of trouble. He spent some time in the military when the First World War was declared and found a talent for forging signatures, mainly to forge leave passes that he sold to his mates for £1 each. He returned home with an honourable discharge in 1919 to his very supportive and loving family, especially his sisters, that would do anything for their brother. He picked up mainly labour work, but spent most of his time organising illegal poker and two-up rings, but he still attended church. He got into SP betting and met Jim Smith in 1922 at the sports club, and that same year he met a woman named Grace Inglis at Mass and went on to marry her. His family had known Grace and her family for a while and thought they were a good match. She was aware of Paddy's criminal past and thought that with enough time he would straighten up. In August of 1922, Paddy spent some time in the Long Bay jail for receiving stolen goods before his family eventually successfully petitioned to overturn his conviction. But while he was there, he met and befriended infamous forger and conman Arthur Alexander Wheeler, who was known by the moniker of the Count of de Velasco. The Count had spent 30 years travelling around the east coast of Australia perfecting the art of forging cheques. He took Paddy under his wing and taught him the art of the pen. He said as long as Paddy followed 2 basic rules, he should be okay. The rules were, always work alone and only deal in small amounts. Paddy idolised the ageing criminal, but would soon forget the Count's 2 rules. In 1923, Paddy had made some more money from farming work and was contracting a transport business to a stone company. That year, Grace gave birth to their son John, who they called Jack for some reason. He seemed once again to keep out of trouble for a while after Jack was born, but in early 1927 his contract was withdrawn by the factory because they'd found out about his criminal convictions and didn't want to associate their business with that kind of man. He then began to spend more time at pubs, drinking and hanging out with other conmen and criminals. He considered himself better than these men, though. He was a man of the pen, a forger, and he was the protege of the Count. But he was still perfecting his art. He'd been forging cheques with varying success since leaving Long Bay Jail, but had been caught at one point trying to cash a fake cheque for £180. His family had hired a criminal barrister who somehow managed to get the charges dropped. But between being caught and the charges being dropped, Paddy had attempted to cash another forged cheque, this time for £750, a massive sum of money at that time. He'd been drinking with a few mates and one of them had shown Paddy his paycheck, and in the short time he was looking at it, he memorised the signatures and the way it had been written out and attempted to copy this onto a blank cheque. The teller at the bank noticed some grammatical and spelling errors in the cheque and the accompanying letter and told the customer that he'd need to go to the back and get more cash from the vault. Once in the back room, he phoned the company the cheque was supposedly made out from, and they denied that they'd written such a document. The teller returned to see Paddy leaving the bank in a hurry and phoned the police, to which he gave a very detailed description of the man that had tried to con around $70,000 in today's money. The drinking mates that he had been with had all been regaled of Paddy's stories about forging leave passes in the war, and after seeing the story about the forgery in the paper, it did not take them long to figure out that it must have been Patrick Brady. They too contacted the authorities and Paddy was charged once again. At the start of his trial, Judge Kerr Lewis was approached by 3 jurors who claimed that Paddy had tried to convince them to have the verdict go in his favour. Paddy played dumb to this, but the judge saw through him and sentenced him to 18 months prison and hard labour. Paddy was released in late 1920s, and it seemed like he'd used his prison time to perfect his craft. He was making between £50 and £100 a week by forging the signatures of other bookmakers, banking on the fact that these people just never thought anything like that would ever happen to them, so they were a little more careless in their bookkeeping. And there was a lot of cash changing hands in those days, so what was a few pounds here or there? He spent the next couple of years running check scams with some associates, but once again he was caught trying to cash a large check, and once again he was brought before Judge Kerr Lewis. And despite Grace's claims that he was a loving father and husband, he was sentenced to 3 years prison and hard labour. When he was released in late 1933, he was constantly being harassed by his family to behave, so he took to spending days and weeks away. He spent some time in Brisbane in early 1934, again forging cheques, and when he returned to Sydney in March of that year, he ran into his old friend Jim Smith. Paddy ended up spending a lot of time on the Pathfinder with Smith. Smith's family would come aboard regularly, and Gladys had met Paddy, although he was introduced to her as Mr. Evans. Paddy brought his son John, or Jack, aboard, but Grace, who was suspicious of her husband's activity, declined to ever set foot on the vessel. He had even been there one night when Reg Holmes had come aboard and witnessed Reg smuggle in what he and Jim Smith thought were drugs. Jim was freely telling Paddy all about the insurance scam and how he was to scuttle the ship. The plan was that they would load the boat with weight and then destroy the intake pipes on the lower deck, and the boat would simply sink to the bottom of the sea. Smith asked Paddy to come with him on the mission, but Paddy declined, although he did assist Smith in preparations for the sinking. He helped Smith load 4 tons of rocks into the hull to ensure the boat would sink. On the 8th of April 1934, Jim sailed the boat to Terrigal, which would be its final resting place. Terrigal was chosen for its small harbour and local police station, where he could immediately report the loss of the vessel. Smith arrived before dawn and took up his position about 2.5 kilometres, or just under 1.5 miles off the east coast, which was far enough out to have the boat sink in deep water, but close enough that he could row to shore. He went below deck while it was still dark and took a hammer to the toilet pipes. The water did start to flood in, but it was going very slowly. As the sun started to come up, Smith felt like it was time to come above deck and prepare to abandon the yacht. He came up on the deck and saw, to his horror, a large ship approaching. This would not be good. No one was supposed to see him, and this was a large coal transport ship that surely had a crow's nest and a lookout. He rushed to get the dinghy untied and climbed into it and started rowing. The ship, the Wallara II, had seen the yacht, and an officer had suggested that they alter their course to see if they could lend a hand to the people aboard the luxury vessel that was sinking. As the ship approached, the officers saw Smith rowing from the yacht, and he'd only made it about 10 metres or 30 feet when the ship approached him. The officer called out to Smith to see if he needed assistance, but the man in the boat ignored the calls and continued to row. The officers on board the Wallara II thought this was very strange. Surely the lone man would need help or would have wanted to be picked up. So when they landed in Sydney later that morning, they called and reported the encounter to the police. It took Jim Smith over 4 hours to reach the shore of Terrigal. The winds had picked up and so had the swell, and by the time he wandered into the local police station, he was exhausted. He told them his story. He'd been taking the boat to Sydney when it had sprung a leak and the water had started pouring into the boat. The engine had flooded and the boat had been carried by the wind north. He had managed to escape the sinking vessel and row to shore. He asked the station master if he could use the phone to call and inform the owner of the boat, and here is where Jim Smith makes a crucial mistake. He gave the police officer the number to ring, and they heard him ask for a Mr. Holmes. Reg Holmes had worked on this plan for months, including selling the boat to 2 different dummy owners so that he was never associated with it, and Jim Smith had just asked for him as the owner of the vessel in the presence of police. When Holmes came to the phone, he asked Smith to leave immediately and come to his house. Smith jumped on a train to North Sydney and walked from the station to Holmes's house in Lavender Bay. When Jim had explained what had happened to Holmes, Reg immediately called Stannard, who was on holiday, but said he would return right away to Sydney. Jim got right back on the train after telling Holmes what had happened, and when he arrived in Central Station, he was shocked to see that Gladys was there. She must have been coming home from work, and he'd accidentally bumped into her. She told him that he looked awful and asked where he'd been and what had happened, and he told her that the Pathfinder had been shipwrecked and that he was lucky to be alive. When they arrived back at their cottage in Gladesville, he ended up telling Gladys all about the insurance fraud and the cut that he was to make, but how he'd messed up when the boat had come along and now how he was likely to end up with nothing. Holmes and Stannard at the same time were worried that it had all gone so wrong, and were actually deciding whether or not to even make the insurance claim. But it was eventually decided that they would need to inform the insurers of the sinking either way, so they told Greg Vaughan that he would have to visit the lending company. Vaughan was not happy with this arrangement, but on paper he was the owner, so he would have to be the one to report the loss. When Vaughan went and met with the agent and told them the story, the insurer was very suspicious about the sinking of the boat. The caretaker, Jim Smith, was alone when it sank, and he refused help when it came along. Goodman, the insurance agent, picked up the phone as soon as Vaughan had left the office and called the police. This would be the second call that the CIB had received about the Pathfinder in a few days, the first coming from the ship that had passed along when they saw the boat sinking. Incidentally, it was Detective Frank Matthews that linked the 2 calls, and he began to investigate. He had called Jim Smith and asked him to come into the insurance office later that week. Gladys had said that in preparation for the interview, Vaughan and Stannard had both come to their home, and Stannard had paid Jim £150 to stay silent about the scam. Smith was happy to have some money from the event, thinking that he would be left empty-handed because of the way it had gone down. He went to the interview on Thursday the 12th of April, and Detective Matthews noticed that he was very nervous and his story was completely unconvincing. Matthews then decided that he would have a follow-up interview and noted that Smith's 2 interviews gave contradicting information as to where the Pathfinder had actually sunk. Matthews then interviewed Holmes, Stannard, Thompson, the first dummy owner, and Vaughan. The businessmen were rattled about having been interviewed by the police, and they all decided to drop the insurance claim. But they were not happy. Jim Smith had ruined their plans, he had bungled the scuttling, and now he couldn't get his story straight, and they were all being investigated. He had effectively lost them thousands of dollars. But surprisingly, once the men had decided to drop the insurance claim, Matthews dropped the case against them, even in the face of clear evidence that there was a massive insurance fraud taking place. Paddy had turned up at Jim Smith's house a few days after the sinking of the Pathfinder, and Smith, forgetting that Gladys had already met Paddy, introduced him to her as Mr. Anderson. When Gladys later questioned her husband as to why this man had different names, he eventually told her that this was Australia's cleverest forger, a man of the pen, and that he went by many names. Over the next few months, Smith and Paddy Brady spent many days and nights drinking together. He was a regular visitor to the Smith home, and they even went as far as to give him the number of their neighbour who would take messages for them when they were out or at work. Jim had quickly gone through the £150 that had been used to buy his silence by Stannard, and was being drawn into Paddy's world of cheque forgery to make some money. He was interested in buying patents on inventions and needed money to purchase these patents so that he could sell the inventions for large sums of money. Paddy realised that with his knowledge of the Pathfinder insurance fraud, he could swindle money out of Holmes and Stannard and Vaughan. After all, they were businessmen. They would know plenty of other wealthy men that Paddy could use the names of to forge cheques. Holmes was approached by Smith and Brady a few weeks after the Pathfinder incident, and they proposed a partnership to him. Holmes would provide the signatures of his business associates, and Paddy would forge cheques in their names, and everyone would make some money. If Holmes had thought that paying off Smith with £150 would make him go away, he was sorely mistaken. They knew everything, the details of previous insurance scams, the smuggling, the Pathfinder. It wasn't so much of a business proposition as it was blackmail. In June of 1934, Holmes ended up providing the men with signatures of 10 of his associates, and Paddy went about forging cheques in their name. Paddy and Jim were joined in this venture by a man named Stanley Watson, who was a thief and a conman and was known to carry a gun. Watson would recruit messengers to cash the cheques, which had been kept at relatively small amounts, and most of them were cashed successfully. A few weeks later, though, Paddy once again disregarded one of the Count's 2 rules and forged a cheque for £450 under the name of Craig Brothers Limited, a firm of butchers. Watson posed as a stockbroker and hired a young man called Geoffrey Johnston to carry and cash the large cheque at the Bank of Australasia. Johnston did as instructed, and without a second thought, the teller handed over 9 £50 notes, and the young man walked out of the bank with what today would be $45,000. Craig Brothers noticed this forgery and reported the fraud, and again it was Detective Sergeant Frank Matthews that was handed the case. He called Mr. Johnston into the police station, and Johnston identified Stanley Watson in a lineup. But neither Paddy Brady or Jim Smith were in the lineup. Neither were named, and neither were charged. Stanley Watson immediately knew because of this that one of the men had turned him in. The culprit was Jim Smith. During the interviews about the Pathfinder, Smith had secretly agreed to be a police informant to Detective Matthews, and now both Paddy and Watson knew it. A few days later, Jim and Gladys were out walking, and Paddy and Watson approached them. Jim told his wife to keep moving while he spoke with the men. Watson had been released on bail, and the 2 men were asking Jim to give them money. Jim told the man he was broke, and that's when Watson took out his gun and threatened Jim Smith, saying that he ought to shoot him for putting the cops onto him. To calm Watson down, Jim Smith gave him £5, which really was all that he had, and Paddy and Watson left. Paddy returned shortly after, telling Jim that he'd fixed it all up with Watson. Gladys was scared. Not only was her husband involved with the insurance scam, but now she knew that he'd become a police informant, and this was trouble. She decided that they needed to get some money to give to Watson just so that he would leave Jim alone. Neither of them believed that Paddy had really fixed things up with Watson, and Watson had had to raise £200 for bail, and they both thought that he'd be coming back to try and get more money out of Jim. They travelled to Reg Holmes's house and asked him for a loan of £50. When Holmes said no, Jim told him that he was desperate. He needed it, otherwise he was likely to be shot. When Holmes asked who he was going to be shot by, Jim told him that it was Paddy Brady and his mates who blamed him for shelving them to the cops. Holmes still refused to loan him the money, so Jim and Gladys left empty-handed, but Holmes now also knew that Jim Smith was an informant. Paddy actually turned up at Holmes's house the very next day and also asked for money. Paddy knew that Watson would come after him as well, because he had also not been charged for the forgery, and Jim may have made a deal that also saved Paddy, so he was desperate to leave town. He told Holmes that he had enough information about the Pathfinder sinking to ruin his reputation and finances and send him to prison. This tact worked on Holmes, and he ended up handing Paddy £40, and Paddy Brady promptly left Sydney and travelled to Tasmania, leaving behind the mess that was Jim Smith's crumbling life. He also left his wife Grace and their son Jack, and they ended up moving into Grace's mother's home. Stanley Watson's trial was held shortly before Christmas of 1934, and he was convicted of forgery and given 3 years imprisonment and hard labour. He was furious and he was out for blood. He was not alone in this crime, and one way or another, someone was going to pay for him taking the rap for the forgery. Jim and Gladys Smith struggled to make ends meet, and Jim had even approached Reg Holmes about going back into the building business. But Holmes now wanted absolutely nothing to do with the man that had screwed him out of thousands of dollars and had turned into a rat, dobbing his mates into the cops. Jim was still trying to raise money to fund his inventions, dressing in his best suits and travelling into the city to try and raise capital, but nothing had yet come of it. One of the associates who Jim was trying to raise capital with was a man named William Allen, who had reported that at one time at the First and Last Hotel, Jim had told him that there would be a move to try and get rid of him. He told Allen that Reg Holmes was at the bottom of it, scared that Jim was going to inform police on his illegal activity, but that Reg Holmes would never do such a thing himself, he would have someone else do it for him. Jim was scared for his life. He had heard whispers around that he was in danger, and he believed them. And so he should have, because 4 months later, his left arm was found in the aquarium after being vomited up by a tiger shark. Paddy, meanwhile, had gotten into more legal trouble in Tasmania and was out on bail for forgery, but instead of waiting for his trial date, he decided to run and head back to Sydney. He needed to find a safe house, a place he could rent that was close enough to the city and his family, but where he wouldn't be recognised. He still needed to conduct business and wanted to see his family regularly, but he didn't want to be found by the police or by anyone that was loyal to Stanley Watson. He settled on Cronulla, which had plenty of holiday cottages for rent, was known for its fishing, and was also home to Hotel Cecil, which was a great place to drink with the locals and spruik for business. In late March 1935, Paddy hired Thomas May, a taxi driver, to take him around Cronulla. He told May he was holidaying for a while in Sydney and wanted to look at cottages with launches for rent so that he could take his family fishing. Thomas May knew just the place. He took Paddy to a seaside cottage called Cord Joy in Gunnamatta Bay. The cottage was perfect. It was a small 2-bedroom shack with a boat shelter that contained a dinghy, ropes, and all the boating gear Paddy would need. May took him to the real estate agent, who came to an agreement with the owner for 30 shillings a week rental price. Paddy, who was then calling himself Williams, met a local fisherman, coincidentally also named James Smith, who agreed to rent him his launch for £1 a week, which Paddy anchored in front of the cottage. James Smith, the boat's owner, saw Paddy take his family fishing in the launch, having a wonderful holiday. The only problem was that sometimes the launch's motor didn't start or it cut out sometimes, so they did prefer to use the dinghy. Paddy was bringing his family to the cottage regularly. Grace would sometimes stay and sometimes she'd be at home. He brought his sisters and their children, and to all that saw him, he was just a man enjoying an extended holiday at the beach. Now, Jim knew at this point that Paddy was back in Sydney and was keen to catch up with his old friend. He did not tell Gladys, however, that Paddy was back, as Gladys was already very concerned over the confrontation that Jim had had with Paddy and Watson, where a gun had been involved. Jim and Paddy spent time in Cronulla drinking at the Hotel Cecil, playing dominoes, and trying to figure out how they could get more money out of Reginald Holmes. They were in the beginning stages of planning to use the signature of one of Holmes's best customers, Frank Carroll, to forge a cheque to the value of over £600, which today would be over $60,000, effectively setting them up for life. On the 1st of April 1935, Jim told Gladys that he'd been hired to drive a fishing vessel for a week and was going to be paid £5. He told her it would be down in Cronulla, but when he revealed that Greg Vaughan had organised the trip, Gladys was not happy about the arrangement. She knew that Greg Vaughan, Albie Stannard and Reg Holmes were still dirty on Jim for the way that the Pathfinder sinking had happened, but they needed the money, and Jim seemed to be in pretty good spirits, so she had finally agreed. Jim stayed home for a few days, telling Gladys that he would wait for the message to tell him when he was needed in Cronulla. On the evening of Sunday the 7th of April, Gladys needed to leave for a few days' work, so at 9 p.m, Jim Smith escorted his wife down Bateman's Road to the tram. He waited with her until the tram came and waved goodbye. As she left, she waved back at him, and that was the last time she ever saw her husband. The next morning, on the 8th of April, Jim was up early. He had a business meeting that day around one of his inventions, and he was headed down to Cronulla that afternoon. He met up with Paddy Brady at the Hotel Cecil and started drinking. A couple of other men joined them, and they continued drinking and playing dominoes. After a few friendly games and some more beers, one of the men suggested that they all meet up again perhaps the next night and play some more games, and Jim actually said that he couldn't because he needed to go back to Sydney that night. At that point, Grace came into the hotel calling out for Paddy. She had been getting sick and tired of being left at the cottage alone and Paddy being out all hours drinking at the Cecil. She and Paddy had a heated argument out the front of the Cecil, and Grace, fuming, left on a bus back to her mother's house, leaving Pat at the hotel. Paddy and Jim left the Cecil and got back into the launch at the wharf and slowly made their way back to the cottage. It was low tide, so they had to anchor the boat at the edge of the deep water and walk across the 100-metre sandbank and into the empty shack. Jim Smith was never confirmed to have been seen alive again, and 17 days later, after his left arm was disgorged by the shark, Detective Frank Matthews and his team were sure that Paddy was responsible. Knowing that Jim Smith had been in Cronulla, the Matthews team went door to door showing pictures of Jim and Paddy to everyone they came across. And at the same time, Matthews and Almond were interviewing Gladys. On the 4th of May 1935, Gladys told the detectives all about the forger that she knew as Evans or Anderson, and when shown a picture of Paddy, she recognised him as the man her husband had said was Australia's cleverest forger. She told them about how Jim had been invited by Greg Vaughan on a fishing trip. She told them about Jim's part in the sinking of the Pathfinder, and told them about the argument that Jim had had with the two men, Paddy and Stanley Watson, when Watson had pulled a gun on Jim. She revealed information about the call her neighbours had received, telling them that Jim wouldn't be returning until the following Monday, and they asked her how many people had possession of that phone number. She said that very few people had it, but that Paddy Brady had been one of them. She even told them that she had actually gone to Greg Vaughan's office asking after Jim, and Vaughan had warned her after she mentioned going to the police that maybe Jim was doing something that he didn't want her or the police knowing about, and that had scared her enough to stay silent. Maybe the fishing trip was a cover for something illegal that Jim was planning. Gladys then showed them a letter that had been sent to her home after the arm had been discovered. It was dated the 1st of May and it was addressed to her son Raymond. It said, "Son, keep your mother quiet. I am in a jam. I plead that it's okay. Call the cops off. Tell your mum I will have plenty soon and we will be all right. They want me. Something in town. Never mind. Be a man for me. Your loving father, Jim Smith." And at the end was added, "Destroy this." Gladys said that although the writing was similar to her husband's, it definitely was not his. The detectives thought that this letter, this forged letter, along with the argument that Paddy and Watson had with Smith, provided only more evidence that Paddy had to be responsible for what they thought was murder. The argument provided some motive, and the forgery of Jim's handwriting was a potential clue to the Count's protege and expert forger that was Patrick Brady. The detectives continued their investigation, focusing solely on Paddy being the perpetrator. They put a tail on all of Paddy's family members, knowing that none of them would come forward on their own, and Matthews and Almond headed to Cronulla to interview potential witnesses. They spoke to Harry Levi, the barman at the Cecil, and he identified both Jim and Paddy and confirmed that they were both there on the night of the 8th of April, drinking and playing dominoes with two other men. He told detectives that Paddy Brady had a cottage nearby and most likely had a boat as they had left from the wharf. Meanwhile, real estate agent Percy Alley had confirmed from a photo of Paddy that he had indeed rented the small cottage to the man who he knew as Mr. Williams. They obtained a set of keys to the cottage and went to inspect it. They found nothing of note in or around the cottage, and it didn't seem like anything was amiss. The detectives left and went to meet the owner of the residence, Percy Forbes. Forbes told detectives that when he had inspected the cottage after Paddy had moved out, he found that there was a large tin trunk that was missing, but it had been replaced with another one. Also, a mattress was gone that had also been replaced with a different one. Some of the floor mats and a rug were missing, and when he inspected a gasoline can that had been at the cottage, he found it almost empty, except for a minute amount of gas and a thick red liquid that appeared to be blood. He even explained how it had given off a terrible odour. He also said that Paddy had reported that he'd lost a rope and an anchor on one of his trips out on the water, but that these two had also been replaced. The detectives raced back to the cottage, now with the information they needed to cement in their minds that this cottage had been a murder scene. They agreed that the trunk that Forbes had described, the one originally in the cottage, might have been big enough for a body to fit into, and that Jim Smith could have been killed on the rugs and mats that were now missing from the property. They speculated as to why the arm would have been cut off. Perhaps the trunk was not quite large enough to fit the entire body in, or perhaps it was cut off and kept for a while to send a message to someone. They also noticed that although this all seemed plausible, the cottage only contained a dinghy, which would not have been large enough to hold the trunk and another man, or maybe two, depending on if Paddy had any accomplices. While one of the detectives was out door knocking, however, they came upon the other, James Smith, who confirmed that he had rented the man named Williams his 5-metre or 17-foot launch while Paddy was staying at the cottage. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together. Jim Smith was lured to the cottage where he was murdered and dismembered. His body was stuffed into the original trunk and weighed down with the missing rope and anchor, and the trunk most likely had been taken out on the launch and thrown overboard to the bottom of the sea. The cottage, Forbes had confirmed, had been meticulously cleaned before Paddy had left. The blood, the rugs, and the mats all disposed of. It all made sense to Matthews, but he still couldn't quite figure out the arm. As detectives continued canvassing the neighbourhood, they had a very revealing interview with Charles Cooper, who owned the Pacific Garage. He recognised the photo that had been shown around of Paddy and told investigators that on the morning of the 9th of April, the day after Jim Smith was last seen alive, Paddy had come to his garage early in the morning, looking like he dressed in a hurry. He looked and acted nervously, unkempt, and he said it was urgent that he get into the city right away. The driver, Bill Brown, hadn't arrived, but instead of waiting, Paddy actually went to his home and convinced the driver to come into work and drive him into the city as a matter of urgency. Paddy had said that he'd been fishing all night and had only just come in, and that his wife was ill, so he needed to get back to her. Brown noticed that he was constantly looking over his shoulder the whole ride. He assumed that the man was checking for if they were being followed. He led the driver to a couple of suburbs and took strange routes, and they eventually came to their destination, a home near McMahon's Point in Lavender Bay. The house that Brown had dropped Paddy off at 8 a.m. that morning was the residence of Reginald Holmes. Matthews listened to this story, knowing that taxis weren't exactly the cheapest way of getting around, and if Paddy could have paid the fare, then maybe he used taxis regularly. So he had Detective Constable Milton Calman ask around other taxi depots in the city and southern suburbs. Calman had been showing around a picture of Paddy when a man named Herbert Swinton McGowan recognised the man. McGowan worked for Orange Top Cabs, and he told the detectives that they had received a booking just before 9 a.m. on the 10th of April. McGowan noticed the passenger, Paddy Brady, was carrying a brown leather bag, a very similar one to the one that Jim Smith was last seen carrying. Paddy asked McGowan to drive around the streets near the house as he was expecting to see a car, but they drove around for a while and saw nothing. Paddy then told him to get onto Botany Road in Mascot. Botany Road was full of second-hand stores and they stopped at a few of them, but at one, Paddy had come out with a single lightweight mattress and at another, a large tin trunk. When they eventually got back to Cronulla, McGowan helped him lift the trunk and mattress through the gate and down the path that led to the cottage, and Paddy thanked him but told him he could manage from there. He paid the driver and also asked him to arrange another taxi for 3:30 that same afternoon from Gunnamatta Park. McGowan arranged the taxi for the afternoon, but Paddy had been coming back from taking the launch out when the engine had died and he had missed the ride. The driver was on his way back to the depot when he was flagged down by a bus. Paddy must have gotten quickly to shore and boarded the bus because he got off it, and he got into the taxi telling the driver that he'd seen him leaving. He told the driver he needed to go to Kensington, back to his sister's. On the way, they stopped for a drink, and about 6:10 p.m. the driver delivered Paddy to his destination. Now, the detectives, having been following Paddy's family for the last couple of weeks, had also noticed that Grace, Paddy and their son had moved from Grace's mother's home to a few different flats, which looked very suspicious, and they felt certain that they had their man for the murder of Jim Smith. At 6:30 p.m. on Thursday, the 16th of May 1935, detectives knocked on the Brady's flat. Paddy had Grace answer the door while he ran towards the back bedroom, intending to escape through the back window. But outside the back window were 3 of the detectives because they assumed he would try to run. Matthews and Almond entered the bedroom and told Paddy to get dressed. They were taking him in. Paddy replied with, "All right, what's doing?" They watched Paddy dress in a suit, put on a tie and grab his hat, and he then allowed himself to be handcuffed and led out of the house. As he was leaving, Detective Calman turned and said to Grace, "I want you to get ready too, Mrs. Brady." And Paddy shot back at him that he would answer any questions put to him, but they were not to drag his wife into it. And that, my friends, is where we're going to end part 1 of the shark arm murder. I will release part 2 when it is finished. I'm hoping for tomorrow, but don't hold me to that because there is so much more to this case, including an attempted suicide, another murder, some very interesting twists into the case of Paddy Brady, and the question of whether one left arm can be considered a body. So I hope to see you for part 2 of this episode, but until then, be good, be safe, and don't murder anyone. Bye!